Well, this morning we start a three-part series on a king you've probably never heard of. You might be wondering why we're going to be looking at the life of someone who lived nearly 3,000 years ago. But I think there's lots we can learn, lots that God can teach us from the life of King Asa. And I want to spend just a little bit of time setting the context before we dive into the passage. Obviously, we're in the land of Israel. And the glory days of King David and King Solomon are a distant memory, something perhaps people's grandparents have faint memories of. That's about it. And there's been strife and warfare since David's son, King Solomon, died, and his kingdom was split in two, with the tribes of Judah and Benjamin remaining loyal to Solomon's son, King Rehoboam, but all the other tribes of Israel who lived to the north of Jerusalem rebelled against Rehoboam, led by Jeroboam. Sounds rather like a battle of different grades of champagne, I know. And so Jeroboam set up a separate northern kingdom, which rather confusingly is usually called Israel. So when we talk about Israel at the moment, we mean the northern kingdom, and then you've got the southern kingdom of generally called Judah, because Judah was the main tribe, that was David's tribe, and Benjamin also joined them, as we heard in the reading about the fighting force. Now this split wasn't exact. There were plenty of people from other tribes living in the land of Judah, and probably the other way around too. But certainly there were, let's just leave it there. And our story starts with Solomon's great-grandson, Asa, becoming king as a relatively young man. And this would have been about 910 BC. As you know, I do like my numbers. But we won't get too bogged down in the names and the rulers. But crucially, the city of Jerusalem was part of Judah, David's city, where God's temple, of course, was situated. And for that reason alone, many people had moved out of the land of Israel into the land of Judah so that they could carry on worshipping God at his temple. And the kings of Israel, the northern kingdom, had set up their own religious sites, their own royal temples, claiming that they were also temples to the God of Israel. But they weren't following his rules or instructions for where the temple should be, nor indeed who should be the priests. It was a sort of state-appointed religion that didn't follow the rules given in Scripture. Pagan gods too, because as well as the tribes of Israel living in the land, there were still many descendants of the original wealth, of the inhabitants who were there before the Israelites arrived, who they hadn't managed to drive out completely in the way God told them to. So their religions were persisting as well, which we get mentioned in our passage. And indeed, often there were both temples to God and temples to pagan gods in the capital, Samaria, capital of Israel, the northern kingdom. I hope that's reasonably clear. But there's a second bit of context we need before we dive in, because this story isn't being told by a contemporary of King Asa. It's actually written in the final form we have in the book of 2 Chronicles by someone who we just call the chronicler, because we don't know his name. We assume it was a him. And he wrote this hundreds of years later, at around 400 BC. And a great deal had happened since the events he's writing about occurred in Israel. Israel and Judah carried on being separate kingdoms for many generations, but then Israel was destroyed by the Assyrians. And then later on, the kingdom of Judah was also crushed by the Babylonians, who, as we know, took God's people into exile in Babylon. And they returned 70 years later. And this is now the time the chronicler is writing, when the people of God are rebuilding. They're rebuilding Jerusalem, the walls, they're rebuilding God's temple, they're resettling the land. They're trying to get things going again. But crucially, they don't have a king anymore. They're still ruled by, well, the success of the Babylonians. And we've already got this history recorded in the books of 1 and 2 Kings. So we can compare the histories written in the two books, and the two writers have very different perspectives. The chronicler covers the same time period, but he's got his own very specific angle. In particular, he's not really interested in Israel, the northern kingdom. He only writes about the southern kingdom, Judah, because that's where God's temple is. And he's particularly focused on the true worship of Yahweh, of God, in Jerusalem. Because in his time, the priests have become the leaders of God's people. They're the ones organizing the rebuilding of the temple, rebuilding of Jerusalem. And of course, that pretty much carried on. That was the situation in Jesus' time. It was the priests and the elders who were in charge of the Jewish people under the rule of the Romans, of course. So at the time the chronicler is writing, God's people are facing a big, scary challenge to rebuild their lives, to rebuild their country, their homes, their temple. And all the while, they're sandwiched between the superpowers of their day, Egypt, Persia, Greece, and later Rome. Well, I hope that helps set the context. I've gone on a bit of length because it should set the context for the next 3 sermons. But I want us to appreciate the setting of this story so we can understand it better. So we're told at the start of our passage that Asa comes to the throne in a relatively peaceful period. There was sort of intermittent warfare between Judah and Israel, but it wasn't all-out war. I think it was sort of border raids and things like that generally. So we're told, and Abijah rested with his fathers and was buried in the city of David. Asa, his son, succeeded him as king, and in his days the country was at peace 10 years. Asa did what was good and right in the eyes of the Lord his God. And we hear how, although he's at peace, Asa doesn't indulge himself. He doesn't want to sit back with a huge court and loads of wives and build up riches. Rather, he gets busy. We read, he removed the foreign altars and the high places, smashed the sacred stones and cut down the Asherah poles. He commanded Judah to seek the Lord, the God of their fathers, and to obey his laws and commands. He removed the high places and incense altars in every town in Judah, and the kingdom was at peace under him. So Asa is serving God as best he can. He tries to keep God's people faithful to God's commands and the religious duties, and to turn them away from all these native gods and religions that have been followed by the people in the Holy Land before the Israelites conquered it. But it's not just religious reform he undertakes. He built up the fortified cities of Judah since the land was at peace. No one was at war with him during those years, for the Lord gave him rest. Let us build up these towns, said to Judah, and put walls round them, with towers, gates, and bars. The land is still ours because we have sought the Lord our God. So, as well as a religious reform, Asa is carrying out a military reform, building up the security of the land while he can, because he knows that they're in troubled times. And then all of a sudden, a crisis looms. We're told in verse 9, Zerah the Cushite marched out against them with a vast army and 300 chariots. Now, we don't know very much about the opposition to Israel. Cush was modern day an area sort of northern Sudan and Ethiopia, sort of below Egypt. And it's not clear if this was an army of Cushites from that area, or indeed whether Zerah was a sort of an Egyptian general, a general of an Egyptian army, I should say, so commanding Egyptian soldiers, because 30 years earlier the Egyptians had attacked and invaded Judah. Anyway, wherever they came from, they're out to get Judah, and Judah is about to have to fight them. So Asa leads the army out, and he leads them not just as a general in warfare, but leads them in prayer to God. And it's that prayer I really want to focus on this morning. Asa turns to prayer before the battle. As we've heard already, Asa called to the Lord his God and said, Lord, there is no one like you to help the powerless against the mighty. Help us, O Lord our God, for we rely on you, and in your name we have come against this vast army. O Lord, you are our God. Do not let man prevail against you. So Asa had followed God in the good times. And now, when bad times are threatening, when calamity looms, he turns to God again. And he starts with worship, hallowing God's name. Lord, there is no one like you. And Asa asks for help, not sort of sitting on his throne back in Jerusalem, but perhaps there in his chariot, leading the army. He's doing what he can. And I wonder, does Asa have a choice here? Well, yes, he does. He's facing a much bigger army than the one he's got. He could negotiate. He could surrender. He could sue for peace, ask for mercy, pay tribute, perhaps accept some form of Cushite or Egyptian rule. Or he could retreat, facing a bigger army. He could withdraw to some of these cities he's been busy fortifying in recent years. Yes, the people of the land might suffer under the invaders, but he might be able to hold out in the fortified cities. Or he could just flee, get a good fast chariot, a treasure box of precious jewels that might be enough to keep him in retirement somewhere, and just flee completely. But he doesn't do this. He puts his trust in God. Now, the chronicler is more of a religious historian than a military historian, so he certainly isn't a great novelist concerned to write suspense or excitement. So we don't get any sort of tense or exciting climax like Hollywood would deliver for this story. Rather, we're just told at verse 12, the Lord struck down the Cushites before Asa and Judah. The Cushites fled, and Asa and his army pursued them as far as Gerar. We're not told how the Lord struck down the Cushites. Presumably, Asa's army fought valiantly and won. There were occasions in the Old Testament where the Lord just threw terror into the opposition and they fled, but we're not really told anything about the battle or the fight. That isn't the concern of the chronicler. I should say that the equivalent passages in book of Kings, he only gets about 15 verses in 1 Kings 15 on the whole life of Asa. So we've got a lot more detail about him here than we have in the equivalent history. Well, there we can leave Asa for this week, triumphant, having pursued and plundered the Cushites. But what can we learn? Well, I think Asa sets us an example in 3 different areas. An example of the knowledge of God, an example of action for God, and an example of relying on God. Let's start thinking about his action for God. Sorry, start thinking about his knowledge of God. Because in verse 11, Asa starts his prayer with, Lord, there is no one like you to help the powerless against the mighty. Asa knows God. He knows God's heart. It's a heart that's on the side of the oppressed and the powerless. Time and again, God told his people to care for the orphans, the widows, and the strangers in the land. You might almost say God is biased against the mighty. Blessed are the poor, blessed are those who mourn. And you might think it's a bit rich coming from Asa, who really is one of the mighty. He's the king. But in this situation, Asa doesn't feel mighty. He's facing a much bigger army than his army. He's feeling weak and powerless, and he knows God is compassionate towards the poor, the humble, and the weak and powerless. So he knows the God he's praying to. Could be a whole sermon just on that topic, but I'll leave that one be for you to think about. Because as well as showing knowledge of God, we saw an example of action for God. In the first part of the passage, he'd acted for God, trying to promote true worship of the true God, trying to get rid of the idols in the land. Now, we don't have neighbours who worship with Asherah poles or temples of Baal or things like that. But surely in our land, in our town, in our own very hearts, there are still lots of idols, lots of things we're tempted to prize and value above God. Anything like that can become an idol. Now I'm thinking we might hear a bit more about idols and false gods next week, because that's the focus of the next chapter. So I'll just leave you with that thought. What do we prize the most? And are we in danger of valuing things above God? Might be our health, our wealth, our status, might be our relationships, our image. Whatever it is, can that become an idol to me? So Asa knew God, he acted for God, and he relied on God. His prayer continued, help us, O Lord our God, for we rely on you, and in your name we have come against this multitude. And we all face many problems, not armies of multitude of armed men, although we're shocked to see Ukrainians facing just that. But at the start of this new year, each of us will face all sorts of challenges. Might be health problems, might be difficult or broken relationships, might be money problems, might be things we face as we look back on our past, ongoing griefs and sorrows, regrets and guilt. Or it might be things looking forward, fears and worries about all sorts of things. It'll be different for each of us. But it can feel very scary, very threatening, whatever multitudes we may face. And God invites us to rely on him. Or, as the older version that the hymn Edith Cherry wrote used, rest on him and to go in his name. As the Apostle Peter put it in 1 Peter 5, cast all your cares on him, for he cares for you. God invites us to rely on him. But what can we actually rely on God for? Because we know he won't necessarily give us victory over every problem and difficulty we face in life. He won't necessarily remove every trouble we have. Well, first of all, we can rely on God for forgiveness and acceptance. We only need to look at the cross to see the measure of his love and the forgiveness he offers through Jesus, his Son. It's up to us to put our trust and faith in him to receive that wonderful forgiveness. We can rely on him absolutely for that. But we know life will still have troubles. Perhaps the supreme example is Jesus himself in Gethsemane, facing a horrible death, not wanting to go through with it if there's any way it can be avoided, and yet wanting more than anything to do God's will. And indeed, the very lives of Paul and the other apostles, most of whom died rather than renounce the Lord Jesus, show that God doesn't offer path in life free troubles and difficulties and suffering. But we can rely on his love, his acceptance and forgiveness, and his presence with us to comfort and to guide. And we can have the knowledge that he will indeed work out all things for good, according to his promise, even though it may not look like it now. And that final glorious promise that one day he will make all things new and wipe away every tear from his people. I look forward to our series in Revelation later on this year to really ponder these truths. So God is faithful. We can rely on him. King Asa relied on him and indeed won a great victory. But whatever happens, we can look to the cross and to the empty tomb to know that God's new life will conquer everything. Indeed, Paul declares we're more than conquerors through him who loved us. He doesn't explain what he means by more than conquerors. I think in the context of the sufferings Paul describes, it means we won't necessarily avoid those sufferings. We'll come through them with the Lord and we'll end up in his presence, whatever we've had to go through to get there. Rather than close with a prayer, I thought we could close this with a hymn. I've gone on about it enough throughout the service, so it's time